Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, as our first episode for 2023, we're kind of doing we're going to be talking about a movie that a lot of you may not have seen, but that it's fundamentally based in a question that's kind of at the heart and soul of everything we do here on Superhero Ethics. We're talking about Dredd, not Judge Dredd. We have traded up from Sylvester Stallone to Karl Urban, and we're talking about dystopia. We're talking about the use of force to deal with crime and problems like that, and the idea of fighting for order in a world of chaos and all the problems that can be regarding that. Whether you've seen the movie or not seen the movie, there's a lot we can discuss because it's really about very universal topics to comic book movies, to superhero stories, to all the rest of it. So I've managed to get through this entire intro without using any of the bad puns that Paul was probably dreading I would use. So let's go to the commercials. No reaction whatsoever?
Oh, I gave my best Geralt of Rivia.
You gave me a Geralt of Rivia stare? That's fitting.
No,
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. I'm joined by fairly frequent guest, Mr. Paul Hoppy. Paul, how are we doing today?
Doing pretty good, yeah. I rewatched Dredd last night, and I think I had pretty much the same feelings I had about it the first time I saw it. Mm-hmm. It's a movie about a lone man with a gun and a motorcycle and a helmet. Very importantly, a helmet against the world. But there's also a blonde who, seems to be like, I don't know. It's I feel like there's a lot of tropes that it like really leans into and then often kind of pivots away from.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me give a quick summary of the movie because a lot of folks may not have seen it or may not remember it. And we're not going to be talking about the exact details of the movie as much as just kind of the questions that it raises, but the details are important. So the movie is about a dystopia. We're told that most of America has been irradiated, and what's now referred to as the megalopolis, the kind of mostly unending metropolitan area that starts in about Washington, D.C. and goes all the way along the eastern seaboard up to Boston, has become, in the sort of future post-apocalyptic time, called Mega City 1. It's just this huge city, and crime is incredibly rampant. Murder, robbery, sexual assault, all these things are really terrible. And as frequently happens at a time of kind of just total desperation and like feeling like crime is overwhelming everyone, the government has created basically they've severely amped up what police can do to deal with it. And there are now these things called judges, and judges are basically hyper trained. They have like all sorts of armor and incredible weapons. I don't think they have superpowers, but they have incredible training and weapons and armor. And they to be judge, jury, and executioner. And so their job is to go out and to deal with crime. And if a person, they're allowed to use lethal force quite freely to try and stop crime. But most importantly, if they, observe someone committing a crime that fits what is this society's standard for lethal violence, they're allowed to deliver a death sentence right there on the spot. And on the one hand, they have to be very sure. So like when a psychic thinks that something happened, she says with 99% certainty, they still won't do it. But it does seem to be a thing of like, if I saw it with my own eyes, then I know it happened without the sort of like, let's investigate for context kind of a stuff. And we can get into those details in a bit. But it's very much about a dystopian society where all this is happening. And then kind of funny, given what Paul and I have been talking about on other podcasts, because we've been saying like, it'd be kind of nice to have a movie where there isn't some great plot arc by the hero. There isn't some like major like world-changing event. It's kind of just a day in the life. That's really what this movie is. Our heroes is a loaded term, which we'll definitely discuss as well. Our protagonists. Yes. Yeah, who is Dredd, who's the Karl Urban character, who keeps his helmet on the entire movie. I think really kind of like, I have a sort of like, Karl Urban grunted so that Pedro Pascal could tilt his head, like
yes.
There's definitely okay, Urban really did it pretty well. And but he's paired with it's a training day kind of a movie. He's paired with a rookie cop. It's her day to kind of see if she can be a judge or if she's going to get kicked out of the program. She's young, she's blonde, she's pretty, and she doesn't wear a helmet because it interferes with her psychic abilities.
Yeah. That's the reason.
Nothing at all. Fair enough. And yeah, she's a mutant, which they don't really explain much, but is a thing in the movie. And basically, they go in to deal with a problem that's happening, and they realize they're actually dealing with one of the foremost drug gangs in the world. And it was very much of The Wire kind of, like, if you have watched the first couple seasons of The Wire, and you know all about, like, the towers, like, Marlo Stanfield is watching the criminals in this and, like, applauding and being like, you have the right idea. Because they figure out the judges are there. They figure out the judges have captured a witness who could bring the whole thing down.
Who is Avon Barksdale, for the record.
Yeah, very much so.
No, I mean, literally, that's Wood Harris.
Say again?
Literally, that's Wood Harris, the actor who played Avon Barksdale.
Oh, yeah, very good point. Very good point. That's I hadn't even connected that. And so they shut down the whole sort of tower. It's like a set of buildings that holds like thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And then the whole movie is just our protagonists trying to both escape and or stay alive and or capture and take down this criminal gang that's doing all these terrible things. And so here's my question, Paul, when I finished watching the movie, because this movie Paul's been trying to get me to watch for a long time, and I enjoyed it, but I had one of those movies where I'm like, I don't know if I'm agreeing with the writers on this, because I fundamentally walk away from this going, the judges are the bad guys. Like, the criminals aren't good, but these judges are fundamentally making everything around them worse. Is that what this movie's about? Is it supposed to be a commentary on overly aggressive police tactics? Is it supposed to be like most of us are cheering on Dredd and watching him blow these people up in horrible and terrible ways? What was your take on, like, what's the movie actually trying to say? Because I was very confused.
Yeah, I think your confusion is well warranted. I think it's interesting because just to what you said earlier, the writer, the screenwriter, actually said, I didn't think Dredd could have a great epiphany, but there's definitely a change in him over the course of the movie. He makes a very clear statement at the beginning of the film, which he then contradicts at the end. But, that's about as far as the shift goes.
Do you mean in terms of that he doesn't think she'll pass the assessment and then passing her?
Not that he doesn't think she'll pass. He says, if you lose control of your primary weapon, that's an automatic fail. She lost control of her primary weapon, and she's like, yeah, I know I failed, but until the thing's over, like, I'm still going to, do this. Right. So I think it's complicated, right? Because I think on the one hand, the story of the movie is very straightforward. If you've seen The Raid, also, it's basically the same premise, right? Like, you have these cops entering this building that then gets shut down, and they're trying to make it to, the primary villain at the top. I do think that the movie is aware and to some extent is commenting on the militarization of police, police killing people, the justice system, having justice in quotes. And I think the original Dredd, Judge Dredd comic from, I think, 2000 AD is the thing that it's part of, which is British, by the way, right? It's a British. It's an American character, but it's a British story about American policing to some extent, I think.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then this film, I believe, was made in South Africa, actually.
Interesting.
And the writer of the screenplay is also English as well. And so I do think there's a level of commentary on, American policing and, some of the problems with it and with the concept in general. And, you referenced the government. Like, I'm not sure there's a government. Like, there's this judge academy, basically, right? There's like the judges, and it seems like that is the government. Like, basically, which, kind of raises the question, like, what is a government? The idea that, like, most places can kind of only successfully have one government at a time. I think there's this idea of, like, the consent of the governed being a thing that, I mean, I don't think exists. Like there's no universal buy-in really anywhere, and societies are not generally super opt-in, right, on like a country level. And I also think like silence is not consent. So I think when it comes to government and like what governments do, like the way I look at it, which I feel like is actually kind of on display here, is that a government is an entity created by people and perpetuated by people that exerts influence over a larger number of people, some of those people consenting to that government and some of them just like, I mean, you could say everyone's oppressed by it, but if you consent to it, then I guess you could say, well, that's not oppression really. But but the point being here, there's this organization of judges that's just like, we're going to do this thing because it's what we do. And it does not seem to me like the population consents to this in any fashion, you know?
I think that's very true. And I think that's, for me, that's one of the first things that really grabbed me. And I'll say all the stuff you said about consent and stuff like that, I'm so tempted to go into like a civics conversation here. But I mean, no, that's a long conversation there. And I would say there, I agree with most of what you're saying. I think I might frame it a little bit differently. But certainly I think you're right. In this setting, and that's part of why I kept thinking about this in terms of like, I don't think the judges are, because he says at both the beginning and the end of the movie that what he sees his role as is like trying to bring order out of chaos.
Right.
And I fundamentally don't think he's doing that. I think the judges are actually doing the opposite. And part of that is granted that we've had a whole lot of focus on police from a more sociological perspective and things like that since the time this movie was made, and especially since the original movie. But there's like four things here I'm wanting to say. So let me actually go back a bit to the original movie. The first movie was Sylvester Stallone.
Okay. Which I have not seen, for the record.
Sure. I assume you don't mind if I spoil it, though.
Right. I'm aware that he takes off his helmet. And I've literally seen the end scene on YouTube or something. Yeah, I don't care about it. I'm not going to watch it.
I made a joke about Sylvester Stallone's acting. I think at times Sylvester Stallone can be a phenomenal actor.
Sure.
I think he's also one of the absolute best at phoning it in there is. And he learned early, like, oh, this is a part I care about. I'm going to really work at this acting. Or, okay, this is a paycheck. I'm going to phone it in.
Yeah.
Judge Dredd is a phone it in movie. But what I'm going with that is the way that movie was marketed, that movie was coming out at a time when, the cultural zeitgeist was very much in a place of crime is bad, drugs are bad, violence is bad. And so any and all things that we do to stop it, even things that seem like downright sadistic and terrible, are totally okay. And, Lethal Weapon was a really popular set of movies about a cop who wouldn't play by the rules because the rules were stopping him from truly fighting crime. And by the way, most of that crime, of course, being done by people of color, with the one movie where they're South Africans, which is a whole other thing. But like that whole like Reagan, Giuliani zeitgeist was very much there, and it went on into the 90s and certainly is now still very much here today. But I think today, at least large parts of our society are much more critical about it. When Judge Dredd came out, the parts of our society that were critical about it were certainly there, but a lot quieter and not being paid attention to. And I don't remember much about the movie, but I specifically remember that, like, the way it was marketed was crime is a disease and he's the cure. Like, you were supposed to be cheering him on as he violently, sadistically killed these bad people. I'm using quote marks with my fingers, which is bad radio, but you know what I mean? Like, and I think part of why I was so hesitant to see this movie is because of that. Because I didn't think about this much as a kid when I watched it, but thinking about it today, I was like, I don't want to watch a movie about how cool it is that a cop gets to use horrific levels of violence in order to stop crime. When this. And so when I watched this movie, like I said, I kept wondering, is the writer understanding the criticism they're doing? And I think they were, and like as you said, and again, I also wonder to what extent it's like the writer had an idea of being social commentary, but somewhere in the process, they also were like, okay, but let's also give the audience what they want in terms of all the cool explosions and stuff like that. Because fundamentally, and this goes to where I started from, your point about the consent, one of the things I'm really struck by is no one in this building in which they're living horrible lives, to be clear. Like the person, a woman named Mama who runs the gang is called the Mama Gang, like, she thinks that the judges are on one side of a floor of the quadrilateral of the building, and she just uses machine guns to kill like 24 people while trying to get the judges. Like, it's a reign of terror, and yet everyone there is like, well, you judges aren't here to help. Even the people who run the medical center, who are kind of neutral and different from it, are like, I'm not going to help you. You're already dead. I can't help you. I don't want to help you. And so to me, what all that goes to is I'm seeing it through the lens of New York City and Giuliani and now George Floyd and all this stuff, where one of the things I think that's really come out is that one of the biggest reasons why, like, there is such horrible breakdown in relationships between cops and the communities they are in theory supposed to be protecting is that cops don't treat those communities as ones they're members of and want to help. They act like invading armies, with all the military technology and seeing the people as the enemy. And this movie is like all of that to times a million, This has been a long rant. I'll let you jump in here, but just to say, like, I think that was why, to me, the movie was so interesting, but also so, like, I wonder what the writer is doing and how much the writer realizes what they're doing.
I think they completely realize what they're doing. I think they also are doing, as we talked about in Desperado, kind of trying to have it both ways, And just in terms of like the original movie, it came out in 95, right? Which was 1 year after, Newt Gingrich and his like contract with America, like, calling it a contract with America is like basically implying that it's like that there's some kind of consent, right? And like this agreement. And then they started, doing all these horrible mandatory minimum sentences. And that was right around when Giuliani, right? And Bill Bratton in New York were and it's interesting because like the New York that we grew up in as little kids, like was there. I mean, I lived in Hell's Kitchen, like, and it was called that not just like arbitrarily. It's like there were a lot of murders, It's funny because I actually grew up in these buildings called Manhattan Plaza that were like these two towers that were, like this village within a city that actually kind of reminds me. I mean, it wasn't at all like it was like the opposite of this Peachtree's here that, the Mama clan like runs. But, this idea of like you can basically have like a city within a city, in a building. And I think that the movie, like it definitely, I think it wants you to like Dredd, root for Dredd, but also understand that the whole thing is just super messed up and that a lot of what he's doing. And at one point, there's this one dude who's shooting at Dredd and Anderson, right? And that's pretty funny. Her name is Cassandra Anderson. And in my notes, I say that she totally, she Cassian Andor's this guy in the face. And those have a lot of the same letters. But then later she sees like that this guy, they're basically helped a little bit by this woman, right, who has like a baby in the next room or whatever. And then she sees a photograph that like that dude was like probably the father of that child and was like this woman's partner. And she just shot him in the face, while he was, I think, pleading for his life.
Yeah. And that this woman, like, there's no question even like that maybe he was an absent father or something. The woman is saying like, look, my husband's out there. I know he's trying to kill you. I'm very worried for him. Yeah. The only reason I'm helping you is so that you don't get into a fight and kill my husband.
Right. And you get and so there's not gunfire here that kills me or my baby and whatever. Right. Yeah, but like, yeah, she's trying to protect her family. She's not like, I am helping you, law people, Right. She's like, please leave as quickly as possible without incident. And so, clearly that's some level of commentary on, it's kind of the Desperado's equivalent of like, everybody I've killed has been somebody's brother, somebody's father, somebody's kid, but at the same time, the movie does like spectacularly glorify extreme violence, right?
Yeah.
While also vilifying the same from, the other characters who are a mix of just horrible, horrible people who are very clearly sadistic, malicious, and, trying to just do harm because pretty much just because they're selfish and horrible. But also even those characters, it's like you can see like some of them were victims of others, and Mama was a victim of someone else before she became who she was, and so I think there is a level of commentary on those structures and kind of how people become violent when they become violent. But at the same time, it's like it's not a very deep level of that, right? Yeah. Like it's there. It's an undertone and it's an implication, but it's not like the overriding theme.
Yeah, I mean, this feels to me very similar, but like in much broader strokes than to The Wire, in that The Wire had the same idea of the problem is these systems, and no one crusader cop and no one drug dealer who wants to like clean up the system. Like none of them are ever going to make any difference because the system is so fundamentally built to keep everything in place or to make things keep getting worse. And like, I think that's definitely because, like I said, I think that in some ways that's why I really like that there isn't any big societal change that happens at the end of this movie.
Right.
Like, there's no sense that there won't just be another Mama who comes along to replace Mama.
Yeah.
Or that anyone in this world has learned a lesson of like maybe we shouldn't do these criminal things. Like the judges are just as much. In some ways, actually, people have learned even to trust the judges even less because we found there were some corrupt judges who wind up getting to a fight with our protagonists. It's very much The Wire, but as I think you said, it's on a much more shallow level.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a 95-minute movie that's like, a kind of an action with like some suspense thriller kind of elements, right? And, I mean, you're just not going to get the same depth in an action movie that you would get in, 50 episodes of, some of the greatest television ever made. But,
I mean, The Wire is very hard to watch, and a lot of people just who really love good television, I've just not watched The Wire or watch an episode or two because there isn't a good guy. There isn't someone to root for. It's all about these flawed people. And I love that. But this is a much more, I'm not going to call it commercially successful because it's just such a different kind of market. But I feel like this is made to be much more mass market.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it wasn't commercially successful, right? I mean, it barely earns back its production budget. It did become, a cult classic.
Oh, that's interesting.
Post-release. But, it was a relatively small movie. I mean, this is a B film, right? In terms of budget. It's the type of mid-market film that I feel like we don't see nearly as much of anymore. And I think that's unfortunate. I feel like now they would be like a movie like this. It either has to be, 9 figures or it doesn't get made, or it's like, a fan film, whereas this was like 35 to 40 million in 2013. So maybe that's closer to like 50 million now or something. Yeah. But yeah, I think it didn't quite, I think it achieved what it set out to achieve, like as a movie, if not commercially, where I don't think it was aspiring to be some like super deep social commentary with really detailed characters, right? Mm-hmm. I do think that there's a decent amount beneath the characters without, I mean, I think the performances are really good. I think if the performances were weaker, it could actually just be a legitimately bad movie. There's some cleverness, there's the 4 corrupt judges who one of them's like, oh, I'll see her, and if I see her first, I'll shoot her, and if she sees me first, she'll hesitate, and then I'll shoot her. And speaking of superheroes, Anderson actually is a superhero, right? She's a mutant who has psychic powers, and she sees her, and the
I'm going to say superpowered individual. I'm still not there with the hero word, but yes,
yeah. Right. Fair, totally. And this, superpower, super villain, like whatever. But the corrupt judge is like, lower your weapon, rookie, and she's like, no, you want to kill me, I'm just going to shoot you. And then she just shoots her,
Right.
Because that's how they do things. And I don't think we're meant to be like, oh, this is a good way of doing things,
Yeah.
Whereas I think we are meant to think Judge Dredd is very good at doing things this way, and does, learn to kind of make little exceptions, but like really little,
I mean, for me, here's the thing, and maybe I misunderstood at what happens at the very end, but there's a thing that he does at the end that really is like, nope, he's the same person. And early in the movie, what starts the reason for the judges to go there is that the Mama gang, at the order of Mama herself, executes a couple of people, and their deaths are very public, and that's why the judges go to investigate. And
skins them alive and then drops them off 200 stories.
Yes. Well, and the thing is, it's not only that he pushes them off 200 stories, it's that they've invented a drug called slow-mo,
right,
which basically makes it feel like time is slowed down for you.
Yeah.
And they specifically, inject these people with this drug for the sole purpose of torture, of having that experience of falling to your death be drawn out to, 100 times as long.
Yeah. That's not why they invented the drug. That's
no. The drug is meant to be a fun drug,
right.
But they give it to them for the sole purpose of torture these people that are going to kill.
Right.
Marlo Stanfield would be like, yes, good on you. I like this.
Right.
Marlo Stanfield is a very sadistic person from the Wire, the later seasons. At the end, not surprisingly, in a very kind of you get what you give, Dredd winds up pushing Mama over the edge so she falls in exactly the same way, and he injects her with the drug. Which, to me, is again, that felt to me, again, very much more like the 1990s, I'm going to make this person suffer the exact way she made other people suffer. Which, to me, was very much the, this is where me and the movie, or maybe the movie is being critical of it as well, but is that this is no way about crime prevention. This is no way about change. This is 100% about vengeance, about these people do bad things, and so they have to be punished. And in that way, I think if that's what the Reg intended, which I think I agree with you that it was, it's brilliant commentary. Yeah. But it's such a perfect way of showing yes, Dredd is getting he's changing a little bit, but he still fundamentally sees his job as not only to stop these people, but to punish them. And to me, that's there are libraries of papers written on how the fundamental problem with the clerical justice system we have is that the goal is vengeance and punishment, not reform or change or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's literally this is the sentence, and it is very, I mean, harsh is not really an appropriate word, right? And that does feel like it's a sort of add-on, just extra sort of vindictive, vengeful thing to do. I did the first time I saw it kind of felt like maybe the idea was also that somehow that, slows down how quickly she'll die from, because I think she's bleeding, right? I think he shoots her first. And so that then she won't, her heart won't stop before she falls to the bottom. But I think that was just kind of a generous reading. I don't think that's actually in there. I think it is just oh yeah, you did this to other people. Now that's how you die.
Right. I want you to suffer.
Yeah. And I think that's the sort of thing that I think is often very appealing to people on a personal level, right?
Yeah.
In terms of wanting to see someone suffer who has caused so much harm. And I think just an extremely poisonous idea to have associated with anything that you're trying to call a justice system or law enforcement or anything like that.
Yeah. And I think the way you said that is so important because, if I'm to claim that, I would never feel that, there's a reason why I've watched the video of Dave Chappelle calling Elon Musk up on stage and the whole audience booing louder than you almost ever hear. a bunch of times. Like, I have Schadenfreude as much as anybody else. I think you're saying it really well. It's that when you build a governmental system of justice on that idea of vengeance, like instead of it just being like, and we go way, way back into the archives. The discussion we had on Desperado was exactly the thing.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there is something satisfying. And when you're looking to have fun about watching, bad people get their just desserts. But it still can be all like, but when it becomes this is how the cop should act, this is how the justice system should act. Oof, we're in bad territory there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things that I think can be like, oh, well, that's not a good thing for an individual to do, and maybe even awful. But then when you codify it and, put it as part of a system and say, no, this isn't not a great thing to do. This is the right thing to do. It's
right.
That now, instead of being one act, it becomes part of a system that will perpetuate that act into similar acts going forward, in perpetuity.
Right.
And that's extra bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it feeds the cycle and continues.
Right, exactly. One thing about the setting kind of was that I did actually feel like this was deliberately made to look kind of like an 80s hellscape, you know? With there's the skateboarding and just the overall vibe felt very 80s to me a lot. And I don't know, there's this homeless dude at the entrance to the building that Dredd is this is, the penalty for this is something like 5 years or something insane, I think.
Yeah. In ISO cubes. Which,
in an ISO cube.
Prison sound, ISO cubes sound worse.
Right, exactly. Although I've actually had this thought since watching Andor that there is an element of the horror of U.S. prisons that is absent from that also would be absent from ISO cubes. Where, I think a lot of the horror of the prisons in our own world are the interactions between inmates and how it almost feels like there is, an attitude of everybody being against each other. It almost feels like that's fostered,
I agree with you, but I'd also point out that in those prisons, the thing they do to prisoners when they want to really punish them is solitary confinement.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, part of that is what are the actual conditions of that solitary confinement? How much can you move? How much light is there?
Yeah.
Is it sensory deprivation, or is it if you lock me in a dorm room with a library, I'm good.
Yeah.
If you put me in a box where I can't stand up straight, that's torture.
We know so little about what those IC cubes are. I think, though, that when they use that phrasing specifically, we're not meant to think this is in any way better.
I agree. Yes. This is totally a tangent. My bad. But I just loved the dude's sign. It says, will debase self for credits.
Oh, I didn't even catch that. That's so good.
Which to me, that just feels like that's a sign that clearly the movie gets something and is trying to say something, right? Yeah. And then when they come back, Dredd's like, oh, you're still here? Okay, we're going to actually, now get the paddy wagon for you. And then Mama closes the doors and the door literally crushes the guy. Which, it seems worse than an ISO cube, but it's not like anybody was offering oh, come with us and we'll make sure you get a bed and a warm meal.
Yeah.
Or is it a hot meal and a warm bed? I don't know, whatever. Something better than, having to sit outside peach trees and potentially get crushed by the blast doors.
Yeah. No, I think that's so true. And it's funny, I hadn't thought of it until you said that, but I think that in another way is part of the commentary because going back to when Judge Dredd was made, again, I don't want to say anything about the comics and when it was made or its context, but one of the biggest parts of that whole tough on crime is the problem, which does continue to this day, but especially was really big in the 80s and 90s, was this belief that cities, especially the quote unquote inner city or the word that was often used, the ghetto, both terms I think we are recognizing today how incredibly racially coded those phrases are and how racist they were. But like that was the thing, and like a lot of it was about like getting suburban people and more rural people to be utterly afraid of the cities.
Yeah.
And that, to me, like that image of the urban hellscape is very much a part of that, you know? And like there's all these studies that have been done that like on the news, like you'd see that all the time. You'd never see like kids playing in a park the way all these cities had, even in the poorest areas, you know, or like a playground or whatever it is. You wouldn't see the good side of city life. You'd just see that urban hellscape. And that's another one of the times where it's like, I don't know if they're doing that to like feed into the still like fear of like urbanization that exists or to be a commentary on it. But either way, it's very much, it's effective.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'll leave it. I agree.
Yeah. You and I are both people who grew up in cities, so I think I have a very different perspective on that.
Right. Oh, yeah, I was going to say it feels like there's this big resurgence of that, right? That kind of, that was a huge deal for a while, and then it felt like it was less of a deal for a while, and then now, you know, on your sort of right-wing bingo card, you have like Chicago, right? Yep. And like, you know, Portland, and it's like they're acting like, you know, I mean, granted, there are plenty of bad things going on in cities. That is true, right? But there's also plenty of community and plenty of good things going on in cities as well. Like cities are just places. And there is a difference between cities and suburbs and rural areas. But it's not this like... It's not the way it is demonstrated most of the times, you know.
I live here in Minneapolis. I live just outside of Minneapolis, but I go into the city quite often. And you know, I lived here during George Floyd, and when there were the protests and the police violence and the counter violence and all of that. I would talk to people who are, you know, were very much on the side of BLM and stuff like that, and they thought just from the stuff they'd been hearing in the media that like half the city was just burned down.
Right.
Or that it was that my situation, like someone was asked, like, yeah, are you getting smoke the way they get like the California wildfires? And like, because I remember you talking about like how much smoke you dealt with when you lived in California, and like, because I was so close, we got a teeny bit. But this idea that half the city burned down, there's one street, one like main urban thoroughfare that like a couple of miles of it, like a lot of the buildings were really badly damaged and like there's maybe like 5 or 6 buildings that were completely destroyed. It was nowhere near what it was made out to be.
Yeah, I think part of that is because let's say you come from an area where, you know, the not urban, but the kind of downtown area of a town is a certain size. And then you see the amount of destruction that there is in a given city, like, and you try and superimpose that on, you know, a town of 10,000, 20,000 people. Well, that's a much bigger percentage. Like, cities are vast, right?
Yeah, if Main Street is burned down in a small town, then yeah, that is 30 to 50% of the buildings in the town.
Right. Whereas if it's 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks in a city, it's like, that's, you know, I mean, I'm not saying it's not a bad thing. I mean, maybe it isn't a bad thing, but that's its own whole thing. But like, I'm just saying in terms of scope and in terms of percentage and in terms of like how big of an impact that has on all of the people living there, it's like it's generally much smaller than what is perceived, because they're not showing like pictures, they're not showing footage of all the areas that aren't that area, right? All the areas where that's not what's going on. Like that's not getting equal coverage.
I want to talk about the way the movie is made, because I think for me there's kind of 2 fundamental questions about the movie that I have. One of which is about the way the movie is made. But first, let's just kind of put a bow on this, because I think we're on the same page, but I wanted to kind of like hear you say it directly. Like, the movie is positing this horrific situation of like, you know, social breakdown and people being in danger all the time and all these things happening. Am I right in saying that I think that the movie, you come away from the movie going, you know, Dredd himself might be having some good ideas, although also all this vengeance, but the judges are not like, this is not a solution that is justified or actually is helpful in this like horrific dystopian society. Is that where you come down?
Yeah, yes. And I feel like the movie is very loosely saying that.
Yeah, agreed.
You know, like basically Dredd is a good guy in a bad system who buys into the system, but the system doesn't really do exactly what maybe the system should do, you know?
Right.
or like maybe it shouldn't exist at all. But I think there's also some stats early on when he talks about like 17,000, serious crimes or violent crimes are reported every day. We can only respond to 6% of those. And, I do think like when you think about these, huge problems that exist, there aren't like really easy solutions most of the time, right? I mean, there's some things like, I think everybody should have healthcare, and like I think universal basic income would be fantastic if you have things structured a certain way, right? But
to me, the fundamental statistic is that the building has 96% unemployment. Like, judges don't fix that. Like, economic change fixes that.
Yeah. No, law enforcement offers no solution to the real problems of that world, right? And you can say, okay, an individual judge can go somewhere and try and, prevent a murder, or probably not prevent a murder because they're just avenging, and then that doesn't really lead anywhere, But like theoretically, they can go to a place and try and stop or... No, I think at the end of it, it just feels useless.
Yeah.
And it feels to me like it's a setting where there's no good solutions, and certainly the judges don't offer any solutions. But within the context of what they're doing, Dredd does a good job of doing the thing that he's doing. But like, it's also just kind of one of those like throw your hands up in the air and like, yeah.
Like, I mean, feel like I would want to see Matt Murdock show this movie to Frank Castle.
Right.
With the hope that like Frank by the end of it being like, okay, well maybe that's too far.
Yeah. But I think Frank Castle would like the movie and would not necessarily take away the same things we're taking away, because I do think the movie, it kind of implies and puts those things out there, but it also, I think, makes it very easy to just enjoy it as like a shoot 'em up with like maybe I'll think about, he tossed her out the window and time's going so slow, Well,
and that is right there the second question I think the movie asks, which is like, because this is a question that like we've had about the Joker movie, we've had about Fight Club, we've had about something else that I think you want to bring up, so I'm not going to mention, but where like, when the point of your movie is to be kind of very critical of this thing, but in order to show the thing that you're being critical, you show it in a way that a lot of people are going to feel like, yeah, that's awesome, glorify that. Like, have you done your job, or is there like a problem? Like, I don't think it's a movie's job to make a point. I think like if you make a movie and you make money, like, and that's the art you want to put out in the world, or just the money making thing you want to put out in the world, good for you. I'm not going to hold you to a higher standard. But I think there's an interesting question when like you put out a movie that is both very critical of something, but if you're not really looking carefully, you're going to totally miss that and actually have the opposite response.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're trying to tell a story, your job is to tell a story, And I mean, sure, in terms of, the capitalistic view of it, your job is to make a money, and they didn't make a money. I don't know why I said it that way, but like, they didn't have a high like return on investment, right? But I do think at the end of the day, as a storyteller, it's like, well, what story are you trying to tell? And like, did you tell that story well? And I feel like they told the story well, and I think one of my least favorite things is when a movie's like, this is the message. And it's like, by the way, did you get the message? I'm going to have a character say the message, and then someone else is going to be like, no, but that's not the thing. And they'll be like, yes, this is the message. And then like just is so overtly having a like an agenda that's just like that. It's hard to tell a good story that way, and there are cases where you can do it well when, if your story is literally about like a political protest, like, okay, now it's pretty reasonable for you to have characters talking about whatever the thing is they're protesting, right? And raising different points and whatever. But there's a lot of circumstances where it's like, well, that's probably not going to make a great action movie, And I think when it comes to like action movies and stories that are, action stories or adventure stories, I feel like really the best you can do is put things out there for people to pick up on, and then they kind of either do or they don't. But at the same time, like, yeah, I mean, if your main goal is to like make one particular point and you make a story or some other piece of art that like can easily be interpreted as the opposite, and then like people are going to take away the opposite, like, I would say you haven't succeeded in that goal.
Yeah.
You've muddied the waters, and maybe you've succeeded in the opposite goal.
I think that's a really good way to put it, and I think a lot of it comes down to like I think I look at this a little more harshly or at least a little more critically when it feels like part of your goal is to be critical of other kinds of media.
Yeah.
And like I think in some ways, this movie is fairly critical of the Lethal Weapons and even the original movie, and like just that whole genre of like rah cops go do the terrible things to the people of color and the poor people because like that's our societal vengeance against them. And yeah, so I think like we talked about that during Desperado, that it felt like fitting, but also a little bit like kind of trying to have it both ways, that you've got this movie about Antonio Banderas. Here he's doing it more in like funny than like gruesome ways, but still it's like, yep, that bad guy died, he deserved to die, oh, but by the way, all of them have like a father and a mother or a son or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's weird because I don't think this movie would have been as good if it had that kind of a point. Like if you'd had the rookie at the end, there's a great moment where she has to perform what we were just talking about, where she has to literally murder the person who is begging for his life, who turns out is the partner of the woman they stay with. And she hesitates at first. And when she performs the sentence, when she executes him under Dredd's orders, because that's what her job is, you can see that it affects her.
Yeah.
And by the end of the movie, she still wants to be a judge. And I feel like you could have had her be like, oh, I think that like this is a waste. She could have made the point of the movie and said, we're not helping. I can't do this. I quit. And on the one hand, I think that would have better made the point, but it also wouldn't have felt real.
Yeah.
And so I'm torn because I feel that, but then I also do think like the movie went pretty far into like glorifying and making it really easy for someone to totally miss the point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are, I think, 3 other instances where they let someone else go, or maybe it's 2. Because there's the one, there's the guy who's, I think it's Bill Weasley, right? No, who is like, he's like the tech guy who's, it turns out, is basically working under threat of death, and torture. And I think they took his eyes out and put in some kind of like cybernetic replacements or something. And, and she lets him go, and she's like, he's a victim, not a villain, or however she says it. But then also Dredd, like, he has some kind of like stun thing for these 2 like teenagers, right? It's like, oh, he's not going to kill the teenagers, okay? And so it does seem like there's, I mean, for her, there's actually, she has the character arc, right? Where it seems like she wants to do this because they stuck her in the academy when she was 9, It's like, it's what she knows. But she also maybe thinks she can do better. Right. And like the idea of doing something totally separate outside the system maybe doesn't really occur to her, maybe because, there's just not a lot of opportunity for that. But she is willing to kind of, first she makes the call like, yeah, okay, I'll shoot this guy in the face because I guess it's what I'm supposed to do, and Dredd's telling me to do that. And then she's like, I'm not going to shoot this guy in the face because I've read his mind and I know this, that, and the other. And so it just, at the end, she does want to be a judge. And she's like learned a lot about what it means, right? Which isn't great things. But like, maybe it's the sort of thing where it's like, well, if somebody else is going to do it anyway, maybe I can do it not as bad,
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. There's just the one line I just wanted to quote where, you know, he's like, "Are you ready?" And she's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "You don't look ready." And then later he's like, "You look ready," or something. Yeah. And it's like she's changed, right? Like that experience of this whole thing has been a character, you know, moment for her. Yeah. Like she has developed as a person.
And in some ways, that's kind of the tragedy of the movie, because like I don't think that's good. Like I think her being horrified at the idea of shooting this unarmed person, like good, you know,
right?
And the thing with the stun weapon also really struck me, because like there's a part of me that's like, well, why aren't you stunning everybody?
Right.
And her line about, you know, well, this guy's a victim. On the one hand, part of what reminded me of was like, yeah, this is why actually cops giving some thought to the context of people before they start shooting is a good idea. Let's have more of that, please. We don't have psychics in our own world, but you know my point. But it also struck me as very innocent, because with the exception of Mama, and maybe not even her, as you said, all the people they kill are victims. All the people they kill, like you said, 96% unemployment. Like, and there are times where Mama says, like, if I find out that you weren't helping to kill these judges, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
Like, all the people who the judges are going after and are going after the judges are victims too. And I'm not mad at the movie for it. I think it's actually a really good point. It felt the way that like we only care about someone when we know their motives, but then we assume that like everyone else doesn't have good motives because we don't know what their motives are. That to me felt very real, and like again, I don't even know if that commentary was intentional, but it definitely came through.
Yeah, I think it definitely was. I mean, I think there was definitely supposed to be a subtext of everybody has their own story, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's affected by all of the circumstances around them, and nobody thinks they're the villain, right? Or they at least, you know, I mean, I saw Wood Harris was basically saying like, yeah, when I was playing this character, like, you know, he doesn't think he's a villain, or at least he doesn't think he's worse than the judges, you know? And it's like, maybe he's not worse than the judges. I mean, he does literally skin some people alive and toss them off of a railing, which like, I don't know, like, I kind of feel like that's worse than at least anything except for, you know, giving Mama the slow motion thing and then tossing her off, you know?
Well, and like, Wood Harris is the Avon Barksdale actor, right?
Yeah.
I do think they had him do something worse, and frankly, it was one of the only parts of the movie that I really didn't like, because it felt kind of exploitative, which is that basically because he figures out that the rookie, remind me her name?
Anderson.
Because he figures out that Anderson, the rookie, who, as we said, is an attractive young woman, can read his mind, he starts thinking these very violent thoughts about sexually assaulting her in an attempt to shock her. And
or
it's
to
not
distract
quite
her,
Game
really.
of Thrones level by any means, but like definitely like we see like a second or two of it happening, and it just like I do think that makes him that was supposed to be made to be like, no, he's one of the real bad ones, but also it was like, really, did you have to do that? Like, post Game of Thrones, I don't think that scene's in there, and I wouldn't have missed it.
Right. I mean, I feel like that was one of two times when it felt to me like I thought they were going to go a certain way, and then they pivoted, you know, where they basically have her be like, oh, well, that's what you want to put in my mind. Now I'll put this in your mind, you know,
right.
And pretty much, you know, kind of like outplays him there. I don't know. I feel you, you know?
Yeah.
I don't feel exactly the same. I feel like it could have gone in a direction where I would have the same feeling about it that you do. But I felt like it kind of pivoted away from that, or into... It went there and then went somewhere else that I felt like justified that. Then further, in terms of like, you know, her character... he then does get the jump on her. I don't think through that. I think it's like some other people are like distract them or whatever.
It didn't really make sense to me why he got the jump on the psychic, but yeah, go on.
Right. Well, no, I mean, I think her power has to be used deliberately at a person. I think it's targeted. I don't think she's like I don't think she has precognition. She can read people's minds, so she's a telepath, right? And and when I think there's other people firing at them, and then he gets her weapon away from her. Now, it is a little bit like, well, why does she go with him at gunpoint if she knows the thing about her gun, right? But anyway, my point being that, yes, I agree that kind of her getting kidnapped or whatever was a little bit like, wait, how does this really make sense? And just felt like they kind of wanted it to go that way. And then it feels like Dredd is coming to rescue her, right?
Yeah.
And then but then they turn it around and actually she ends up saving Dredd, where Dredd basically, loses the fight to Lex, the head corrupt judge, because he's out of ammo because he's been fighting all day. And he's like, wait. And Lex is like, me? Wait? He's like, wait for what? Wait for so you can enjoy your last few dying moments? And then she comes out and shoots him. And he's like, wait for her to shoot you.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a nice kind of subversion of the trope of like her getting damseled or whatever. And
definitely.
And then I also enjoyed that it's like, it's a movie with, a male lead and a female lead, and it's not romantic. There's not like
nothing of that,
at all, and it's just like, this is training day, and it's like one of them happens to be male and the other happens to be female, and it's just, it's training day. And
without
and so I
him being
that.
Super corrupt, but yes, I agree with what you're saying.
Right, yeah. Except he's Dredd and not Lex, and then it would be training day if she was Lex's apprentice, right? But just in that terms of like, that's the relationship, right? It's the the cop and then the rookie cop on the first day out, basically.
Well, and just pulling it back to the question that just pulling it back to the question that I asked a little while ago, also in terms of like what the movie is doing. And I thought this is what you were going to bring up, because I think you mentioned a couple times, maybe I'd misunderstood you. One of the things for me, the thing I will always think about in terms of this, like, what happens when you are critiquing something, but also doing the thing you're critiquing as part of that, is Hunger Games.
Yeah.
Where, the books are, and I don't think it hits you over the head too much, at least in the books, maybe a little bit more in the movie, but it's meant to be a critique of the kind of glorification of, like, watching, like, young people, like, fight with each other and things like that. And kind of our a lot of things like that. And so when they made in the books, there's not, the fight scenes are very briefly described, because the whole point is like, we're not supposed to be like enjoying the fight scenes. Mm-hmm. And the director of the movie, at least the first movie, had that as a very particular aim in mind of, and he said in a quote, I mentioned this a bunch of times before, but like, I don't want kids to walk out of the movie and want to reenact the fight scenes.
Right.
And I don't think Hunger Games did that perfectly by any means, especially in the later movie, but to me it did kind of set a standard. And so that is what I always think about when I think about movies like this. And I think, I think there are definitely, like, I've seen some movies that are like, in theory, about like, sexual exploitation, and all the scenes take place in strip clubs with a lot of focus on like people writhing in very little clothing as a way of being like, look, sexual exploitation is bad, and you're definitely not paying the money to like watch the sexual exploitation on screen. Not that sex work is, but there's a whole other conversation there.
Sure.
I hope you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And I don't think this movie is that bad by any means, but I do think that, like, I think the way you described it is perfect. Like, it has a message, and the message is interesting, but it's not, no one sat down and said, I need you to give me this money because I need to tell this message. I need the world to be better. They thought, let's make a fun movie based off of a really interesting story, and we're gonna have some commentary in there. And if people miss the commentary, that's fine, because it's still a good story.
Yeah, give or take. I do think that the Hunger Games, like, I respect that that's like what they were trying to do. It's still, to me, it doesn't really feel different to me. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know, I didn't feel that they really did what they set out to do necessarily, like,
that's fair.
It still felt like it was, it's supposed to be a critique of this thing, but it's like, it is also still the thing,
Right.
And I feel like, I'm not sure how much Dredd is a critique of action movies as much as of, sort of policing, and particularly like U.S. policing. But it does feel like it's, setting out to kind of say one thing while also doing the other that's kind of like really at cross purposes to that. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if I heard from someone, oh yeah, I had kind of thought about being a cop, but when I saw Dredd, like, it made me more want to do that, But I could also see someone having kind of the opposite response. And
yeah, I mean, a lot of cops, clearly misunderstanding it, but a lot of cops have like Punisher symbols on their tattoos or whatever. You're not getting that with Dredd. I think Dredd is more extreme for that, and that's good.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say that, like, there's the iconic line, and I thought it was delivered very well in this, where it was like, Dredd is addressing everyone in the building through some, little really ancient looking technology terminal.
Yeah.
Like, the way Star Wars is like 1970s tech, this is like 1980s tech, and even though it's in like 2080 right. is the setting, right? But he's like, Mama is not the law. I am the law. And that's like, his big thing that he says, Right. And I used to play a character in a role-playing game who was like the sheriff of New York or whatever, and he was a vampire. And like he was really into like the Anthrax song, I Am the Law, which is this Judge Dredd thing. But the funny thing is that the character was originally, like, as a kid, was an anarchist in the Spanish Civil War, and then kind of like became the fascist, and I think that, I don't know, that kind of cycle, like, I feel like that's a thing,
Yeah.
Like people fight against the thing they're fighting against until they are the thing that they were fighting against.
I mean, I think, like, I don't want to go back over Andor, but I think Andor has a couple of versions of that story in various ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think also you put your finger on something that I hadn't quite figured out, but that I think really kind of squares the circle that we're talking about, in that I think you're right. It's that the movie is being critical of policing, or at least trying to make some commentary and raise some questions about policing and the militarization of policing. And I think a lot of other people, have a critique of the role that the rah-rah cops, kill all the criminals movies of the 80s and 90s, and going forward today, but especially that period, had in contributing towards the cops are always good, criminals are always bad idea. And so I'm kind of bringing that further. And you're right, that part of it, this movie isn't engaging with. This movie is not trying to say that that I'm in a genre of movies that have contributed to this thing that I'm critiquing. They're just critiquing the thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll also say, like, the movie's only 95 minutes long.
Right, you can't do that much.
Right, and I think it's a good choice. I think, like, not every story has to do everything. I think you can try and, especially in terms of telling a coherent story, I think very often shorter is better. And I think often when you want to make a point, I think not belaboring it is better, as much as I fail to not belabor points when I am just talking freeform.
We're going to try very hard to keep that. I think this podcast is going to come in under 95 minutes, but it might be close. But
I certainly hope so.
I definitely agree with you. And yeah, we are about to wrap up. I've just got one more big point we want to get into. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's good that it's short. And like I said, I think it's good that it is a day in the life movie. Like, I don't get the sense that, like, this is obviously, I think, like, if you ask Dredd, like, what are his 10 worst experiences, this is probably in the 10.
Right.
But this isn't the thing that makes him quit the Force or anything like that. This is just, it's just one more day for him.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
I want to actually get in. Go ahead.
No, I'm just agreeing.
Yeah. So I actually want to get into Dredd a little bit as our last point. We'll do that right after this. Welcome back. So Paul, here's my last question. We were just trying to get into it. Why do you think Dredd does this every day? Like, he's one of the first. He starts out with a little bit of this hopeful statement about, bringing order out of chaos. But very early on in his training of Anderson, you see that he's very cynical and jaded. He doesn't think this is going to do much good. He's just trying to, like, live through the day. Why do you think he does this?
It's a good question. I think it's because it's what he knows, Mm-hmm. It's what he's trained to do. It's what he's good at doing. And kind of like, what else is he going to do? I think is like basically just his motivation, It's like, it's who he is. And that's why he does what he does.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And in some ways, I think that's almost some of the most searing commentary of all of it, is that and I think, again, this is what The Wire also really does well, is that the problem with these systems is that when you're in the system, like, you just do what you do. You don't think of yourself as like you are this fundamental force for justice or for injustice. You're just trying to do your own little thing in this own little place, and you don't think about it much beyond that.
Yeah.
Because, like, if I went through this, I'd be like, hell no, give me a better job. Like, I'm not doing this. Right,
but, like, looking at this setting, I'm sorry, what is that better job?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. And that's, like, why does Kay, the Wood Harris character, do what he does? Well, because he lives where he lives, and, like, what are his other options? You know? And I'm not saying either of them are doing the best thing they could do, but, like, sometimes just when you're in a situation, or you're in a particular setting, and it's like this is, you know, this is the thing, and there just aren't obvious better options, you know, even if it's like, yeah, well, actually, if you can get that good at a thing, maybe you could get that good at another thing, or maybe you could use those skills to do something different. I don't know. And I think there are some, you know, within the Judge Dredd comics, I think there is this, I think, like, maybe he's got this complicated backstory and, you know, these family things, and, like, there are big things about, like, what happens with the whole system, and I think there's a lot going on there overall. And I think this movie was basically just like, I think it had the self-awareness that it wasn't going to be able to introduce the setting and tell a story about a big thing happening within the setting, and instead chose to say, okay, we're going to tell a small story in this setting while introducing you to the setting, basically.
Right. And even there, it leaves out what is presumably a big part of the setting, but maybe it's not, in that almost always when you have a dystopian movie like this, you do get to see the 1%. You know, you do get to see the people who are profiting from all these people living in misery, and who, on some level, the judges are helping to keep safe. The people in Elysium, you know, take the Matt Damon movie that I recently saw. Yeah. We don't get a word of that. There's not, like, it might be that this is how everybody lives.
Right.
And it's just, I again appreciate that, because it's not, like, part of me would kind of love, like, a Dredd TV show, but part of me doesn't. I just like that, like, no, we don't know everything else. We just see this one little picture of it.
Yeah, and, like, I think if you wanted to do a TV show, you could tell the bigger story, right? You could do The Wire, basically, right? And you could have introduced all those other gangs that Mama overthrew, right? And you could have some information about how, you know, the world got irradiated, and like are there people living comfortable lives somewhere, right? But, like, if you're doing a 95-minute movie, or even if you're doing a 2-hour movie, like, an extra 25 minutes isn't going to get you from, like, point A of, like, a day in the life to point Z, which is, like, a big deal story.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, Paul, any other last comments you wanted to make?
Yes. This is, like, a huge topic that I don't necessarily want to actually delve deep into, but I think the concept of mind reading in a law enforcement context is interesting. I don't know. It really is. I feel like the movie didn't really dig on that, but it just kind of treated it kind of de facto. But it's like, yeah, that seems like kind of a big deal.
It is. It really is. Have you seen Minority Report?
I have, yes.
Yeah, I don't think that movie did a good job dealing with it, but at least it raised some interesting questions about it. Because you're right, especially because, to me, I think in the movie we see mind reading by the cops used in two fundamentally different ways. And I think there's a huge ethical difference between the two of them. And you're right, this would be its own episode, but definitely worth exploring. And maybe we do something like about Professor X again about it, because that's where a lot of it comes from.
Sure.
But one of it is, you have had bad thoughts. You have thought about doing a bad thing, and now I'm going to take action as though you have done the bad thing. Or maybe, like, you're taking thoughts about planning to do the thing. And
yeah, or
obviously there's a lot of gray area there. but basically like, I'm going to punish you because of your thoughts. The second one being, your thoughts have told me that your actions are not what I thought they were, that they're not as bad as I thought they were, and therefore I'm going to let you off of punishment, as happens to the tech guy. And I like that they show both, but you're right, there's a big ethical question. There's a lot of ethical questions, because I think those two are so fundamentally different.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the idea, like, can a thought be a crime? Or like, can a thought reveal that you did some crime, or that you did some crime under duress or whatever? I will say Minority Report feels to me like a fantastic example of a movie that is trying to introduce a setting and be an action film and have a really big deal thing within that setting go down. And I think fails on that account, basically.
Yeah. I mentioned Elysium before, and to me, both of those are movies that really are talky movies. Like, I don't care about big, flashy action scenes, and I think they take away from what those movies should be, and yet they both feel like they need to have them.
Yeah, and that's always, I think, the thing. Like, if you say, I want to make an action movie, if you just start with that premise, and then you say, I want to make this big commentary or statement about such and such, I think you're already trying to do too much. And I think you basically need to say, I want to do this big action movie and I want to make this small commentary about such and such. I think you're good. And if you say, I want to make a big commentary about something and then have bursts of action, then I think you can do Andor, which even I feel like actually does a really good job of not overtly commenting on things as much as showing things, right, in certain ways. But
also, like, Andor has significantly less. Like, I've been rewatching Bad Batch recently, and there's a fight scene in pretty much every episode.
Yeah.
Andor, like, in terms of like ratio of screen time that is fighting to screen time that is not, it has got to be far and away the lowest of any Star Wars property.
Yeah. And that was kind of my point, was that because of the format, because it's this like new hybrid format where they basically made 4 movies and released them in episodes. And, they basically decided we're going to have, an action climax to a bunch of non-action movies, basically. And so it definitely leans more on suspense. And that's what I meant about, like, if you want to put that much characterization in, well, you just don't have room for the kind of action that like an action film demands, right? Action movies just, it's like there's like some contractual obligation that more than 50% of the movie has to be action, right? And you can only have so much dialogue. It's kind of
funny because the whole point of this podcast is to talk about the commentary that happens in action movies.
Right. So. And what I'm saying is, like, I feel like you only have time to do a little bit and make a few points and raise questions. Honestly, to me, that's the best thing an action movie can do in terms of trying to get people to think about things, is raise some questions and and encourage people to think about things, because you're going to have a lot more time to think about things outside of watching the movie than in the movie. And, like, if the movie makes you think, that's great. I think more thinking is better. So, Yeah,
I think it's really true. All right, I think this is a good time to wrap up our main discussion. Paul, as always, thank you so much for being a part of this. We're going to go into our Patreon-only last section in just a moment. But for those who aren't patrons yet, let me just say, as always, thank you so much for listening. This is all part of The Ethical Panda, and you can find all the ways to contact us at theethicalpanda.com. Would love to know your thoughts. Would love to know your feedback. Have you seen Dredd? Have you never seen it? What do you think about what we've talked about? Would love to hear from you. Find us on email, Twitter, TikTok, all those places. Just search for The Ethical Panda or go to theethicalpanda.com to find all the info. Paul is Zen Madman. You can find all sorts of stuff about what he's doing by Googling Zen Madman. But mostly, I just want to really encourage you, if you can, if you enjoy these podcasts, if this content is bringing something into your life, take a moment and check out our Patreon page. The link will be in the show notes. It's also on our webpage. It really would be so helpful if you can just throw in just a couple of bucks a month to help support the work we're doing here. I love making these podcasts. It is expensive. There's a lot of expenses that go into it. There's a lot of things that I want to get to be able to help further improve the quality of the content we put out for you. And even just, at the lowest level, you'll get, there's different benefits that you can get, including some of the patron content, all the patron content that we're talking about. bonus episodes and bonus content at the end of every episode. You can get ad-free content, not have to listen to the ads every week. There's so many benefits you get. There's so many ways that you can help and support us. So please, 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 if you got that couple extra bucks a month and you really love this content, take a moment and just check out the Patreon. Maybe it's not going to be for you. That's no problem either. But if you think it's worth it, would really love to have your support. If you're not up for that, other great ways to support this podcast is leave us a 5-star review wherever you like to leave reviews. Share it with a friend. Get other people listening. Help share what we're trying to do with this podcast and with my other podcast, Star Wars Universe Podcast, with other people. So on behalf of myself and Paul, thank you so much for listening. If you can stick around for the bonus content as a patron, it'll be coming right now. And if not, thank you so much and have a great day.